Datuk Dr. Ui Ki Beng, Executive Director of the Penang Institute. Dr. Ulrich Zachau, World Bank Director of Regional Partnerships. Mr. Faris Haddad Zavos, World Bank Country Manager Malaysia and Steering Committee Member of the National Productivity Council. Dr. Richard Record, World Bank Country Economist for Malaysia. Associate Professor Teo Wing Leong, Head of School of Economics of the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Puan Rauzah Zainal Abidin, Director of Productivity Development of the Malaysian Productivity Corporation. Datuk Heng Hak Lee, CEO of Globtronics Technology Berhad. And Mr. Tim Nicholas Schwab, CCO and Acting Head of Economics Program at the Penang Institute. Distinguished guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening and welcome to this forum organized by the Penang Institute together with the World Bank Group on the subject Malaysia Economic Monitor, the quest for productivity growth. Economic growth in Malaysia has been resilient in recent years, showing a well-diversified economy and solid macroeconomic fundamentals. The Malaysian government is putting emphasis on moving into a higher value-added growth model to become a high-income economy. Yet, there are still emerging structural constraints as capital accumulation faces headwinds. Today's forum is therefore very timely in order to further discuss this matter. Ladies and gentlemen, to start off this evening's proceedings with his welcome address, I'm delighted to invite on stage the Executive Director of the Penang Institute, Datuk Dr. Ui Ki Beng. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Datuk Dr. Ui.
Thank you, Jack. Welcome, everybody, especially in the middle of the week and right after dinner. Well, let me start by saying welcome to our distinguished guests. First of all, Dr. Ulrich Zachau, World Bank Director of Regional Partnerships. Can you hear me? Yeah. Mr. Faris Haddad Zavos, World Bank Country Manager for Malaysia and Steering Committee Member of the National Productivity Council. Dr. Richard Record, World Bank Country Economist for Malaysia. Associate Professor Teo Wing Leong, Head of School of Economics of the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Puan Rauzah Zainal Abidin, Director Productivity Development, Malaysian Productivity Corporation. Dato Heng Hak Lee, CEO of Globtronics Technology Berhad. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Penang, and welcome to Penang Institute. This is actually the third time that the World Bank is presenting the Malaysian Economic Monitor here at Penang Institute. Now, as a think tank, Penang Institute is, of course, always interested in hearing from experts and researchers, especially those from esteemed institutions such as the World Bank, about what the economic situation is for the country, the region, and the world. Now, I know that the theme for today is rather technical, the quest for productivity growth. But I think to put that in layman terms, it actually means very, very simple bread and butter issues where the common man is concerned. And we will be discussing the Malaysian economy, of course. And although this report was launched a few months ago, I think much of that will be discussed today will still be of great relevance to us. Now, much has been happening in the world over the last few months and in the country, which have been controversial, and the consequences and significance of much of this are not clear to the common man. What the common man knows is that things are in flux, and not only economically, but also strategically, politically, and so forth. But how will he be affected? How will his children's education be affected? These are questions of great interest, and I'm sure in the discussions tonight, although the theme is, as I said, rather technical, all these issues will be touched on. And if they are not touched on, I hope that the crowd will help to raise these issues for greater discussions. We do hear about terms like industrialization 4.0, Internet of Things, online shopping, rise of China, American nationalism and emerging isolationism perhaps, and the unending electoral politics in Malaysia. How does one make sense of all this, and how will all this impact the economic growth of the country? And it has been discussed quite often in Malaysian newspapers about productivity. Has Malaysia actually reached a point where it becomes clear that we are caught in some sort of middle income trap, or whatever one wants to call it? And to get out of that, of course, you have to have productivity growth. Now, one good way, of course, is for us to understand all this is to have figures, to have statistics, and of course, the World Bank is, of course, well known for providing us with some of the best charts and tables and whatnot on the economic situation in Malaysia and in the world. And that, I believe, is what we are going to get a lot of insight into this evening. Now, you did not come here tonight to listen to me ramble on in general terms about the state of the world or the country, and I'm no economist, as should be obvious by now. So I will quickly vacate the floor. I look forward as much as possible to the discussion, very much to the discussion, as much as you here tonight. So once again, welcome to Penang Institute, all of you, our foreign guests and our local guests. And please feel free to air your views on the economic state of the country in the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ooi. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very privileged today to have with us the World Bank Director of Regional Partnerships, Dr. Ulrich Zachau. It gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Zachau to give us his welcome address. Please welcome Dr. Ulrich Zachau.
Good evening. It's really a very happy day for me because it's my very first visit to Penang. I arrived last night. I admit that I'm going to leave tomorrow morning, sorry. But next time I'll come not in an official capacity, but, you know, privately, and I hope to spend more time. It's already clear to me. So I want to start with that impression. Now, I've been living in Bangkok for 4 years now, and I've been coming here frequently. So even more shame on me for not having come to Penang earlier. But what I want to do tonight is to set the stage for the main course. So I'm like the little bit in a menu that you get between the starter. You just had the starter, and the main course is going to come, and I'm that little taste, amuse-bouche, or little bit of ice cream that you get in between, or sherbet, and I hope it tastes okay. Now, what I want to try and do is set the stage, and what you're going to hear is a presentation of the findings, of the meat, of the key essence of the Malaysia Economic Monitor. And the Malaysia Economic Monitor is a publication that we issue every 6 months, roughly. And there are two parts to it. One part is about economic developments in the country, and the other part is on a special topic. And I'm going to say a little bit about each. So in terms of the overall economic developments, the big picture story is that it's good news compared to the last time when we did that report. So the last time we reported that growth in 2016 was 4.2%, and we projected 4.9% growth for this year. Now, we're going to notch up our projection of 4.9% for this year a bit. A few notches. Richard prohibited me from telling you exactly by how much because the report is embargoed, until a few days from now. But let me just say we're going to notch it up just a little bit. And so growth has been faster in the first part of the year than anticipated, and we expect that to continue and hold through the rest of the year, so that total growth for the year will be a little higher than originally anticipated, just slightly north of 5%. So that's our projection for this year. Now, what's driving this? There are a couple of things that have happened. One of them is that exports have grown extraordinarily rapidly, much faster than expected. Now, imports have also grown. Now, for those of you, even those of you who are not economists, exports are something you get money for. Imports is something that you pay for. So it really, for what remains in Malaysia, really what counts is the difference, export minus imports. It turns out, that also contributed to growth, but what contributed even more was domestic consumption, what you guys all buy in terms of goods and services. And so that really grew a lot, and more and faster than we anticipated, and this is a good thing. And we also expect it to continue a little faster than previously expected next year, and then the year after. So we expect growth to be pretty much in that neighborhood for the next 2 or 3 years. And by the standards of an economy with, $11,000, $12,000, $13,000 per capita income, this is very good. There are not many economies of that level of income that grow that fast. Europe is like my own country, Germany. We're growing, it's desperate, if we reach 2% at some point ever, and then our United States. So the rest of the world is growing much more slowly, except China, of course. And China is a separate story, which we can cover, in questions and answers. But so what I want to leave you with here is a sense that there's good economic news compared to sort of 6 months ago. Things have gone better. There is a development on the export side, but the real story in terms of the contribution, the impact it has on how much money is left in Malaysia has to do with domestic consumption and investment. And that is unusual for a middle-income country, higher middle-income country, advanced middle-income country that's going to reach high-income status. It's unusual for a country to have that level of income. Now, you're going to hear a lot more detail in a lot more technical terms from Richard, but that's what I want to just set that stage. Now, the second part has to do with productivity. Productivity is a wonderful abstract word. And how many of you in the room are economists or know something about economics? Please don't be shy. Okay, so maybe 10, okay? So productivity is the idea that you measure, how much effort it takes to do something. And so if you basically put in, 1 hour to be able to buy a burger at McDonald's, and your neighbor only puts in half an hour to be able to buy that burger at McDonald's, guess who is more productive? Right. Now, I'm leaving out all kinds of other complications that one might bring into it, but the question is ultimately, how much time do I put in to make a certain amount of revenue or profit or income? And that's how productivity is measured. And ultimately, when a person is more productive, that means they produce more value for society. And it doesn't mean that that person is more valuable than another person. It simply means that they are doing something that they get paid for more than somebody else. And it's not right or wrong, it's simply that the market values it more highly. And that means more productivity. So what it means to be more productive, what it really means is to produce higher value added products and services that other people are willing to pay you more for. And the quest really is the challenge for a country when we talk about how can you rise up in income? How can Malaysians become richer and earn more incomes as a nation? Every one of you on average. What does that take? It takes all of you, and for me as a German, it's the same in Germany or in Thailand where I live. It takes all of us to have better skills, higher skills that enable us to be paid more for the skills that we have. That has a lot to do with education and skills development at all levels, from primary school up to, you know, university and doctorates and all of that stuff. So better skills, really important. And it also has to do with productivity. And productivity meaning that we do things and we're doing it in a way that they are more efficient and faster and we get paid for it more. The two are related, the skills bit and this productivity thing. And quite how, the truth is, you know, actually nobody has exactly understood. And that's why economists invented a concept that Richard is going to talk about a little more. It's called total factor productivity. And really, nobody really knows what it is, except that it's really the difference between everything else that one can explain and what we observe. So, but it's just a trick of saying that we're trying to measure, you know, what's actually that increase in efficiency that comes. And I'm, again, simplifying a whole lot. So for Malaysia to become richer, what it means is that people need to earn more. And they need to earn more because they're more productive and they have better skills. In all countries in the world, that's a challenge. In Malaysia, it's a challenge. In Thailand, it's a challenge. In all countries of Southeast Asia. Now, in Malaysia, total factor productivity, this concept that I mentioned, has grown about 1.8%, you said, between 1990 and 2014. 1.8% a year. Now, in Korea, it was 2.2, I believe, no? Roughly. And in East Asia as a whole, it was almost double that. So that productivity has increased more slowly in Malaysia than in the rest of East Asia. And I think that is something where then the question is, what can Malaysia do to increase the rate of this growth in productivity? And we believe that Malaysia will be able to have some answers, and Richard will tell you all about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ulrich Zachau. It was a very scintillating and fulfilling amuse-bouche, and prepares us well for our main course. Ladies and gentlemen, the 15th Malaysia Economic Monitor focuses on the need to increase total factor productivity and labor productivity through skills, innovation, infrastructure, and efficiency to increase productivity growth in Malaysia. We are very fortunate today to have with us Dr. Richard Record, World Bank country economist for Malaysia. Dr. Record will be presenting to us on the Malaysia Economic Monitor, the quest for productivity growth. He will expound on recent economic developments and outlook, the associated risks, and the drivers of productivity. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome the World Bank country economist for Malaysia, Dr. Richard Record.
Good evening, everybody. So my name's Richard Record. I'm the main course and also the country economist for the World Bank. Essentially, that means that I spend my time trying to understand what's going on in the economy in Malaysia, getting a sense of the drivers of change in terms of the real sector, production, trade, exports, what government is doing in terms of fiscal, taxation, public expenditure, and what's going on in the monetary sector, inflation, exchange rates, and all that kind of stuff. And so it's been fascinating. We've had a day today in Penang, listening and learning to a number of the institutions here and getting a sense of, you know, what's the pulse of the sort of beating heart of Malaysian manufacturing up here in Penang. So this is a nice chance. Perhaps we can share a little bit of our understanding looking at the numbers, but perhaps even more useful, I think we're looking forward to the discussion afterwards and hearing a little bit from you about how it all fits together and how you see some of this storyline coming together. So I'm going to present something called the Malaysia Economic Monitor. In the World Bank, we're often known as an organization that spends a lot of time getting into the deep technical microanalysis of particular issues that constrain growth and development in developing countries. And that often usually results in producing a very thick report with very detailed information, usually at a very specific set of policymakers and clients. Whereas the Malaysia Economic Monitor is actually something very different. This is something that we do every 6 months, so we try and come out on a high-frequency basis. It's not a long report. If you look, it's a sort of almost a magazine length, and it's our sort of attempt to try and take a lot of that technical knowledge and analysis and distill it in a little bit more accessible format and engage with a much wider range of stakeholders, including here in Penang, and hopefully this is something we can keep on doing in the future. So the structure of the report is 2 parts. The first part looks at the economy, and so we review what's happened in the last 6 months. This is the vehicle that we release our projections when we undertake models and give our estimates of how we think things will go in the economy. That's the first half, and I'll take us through a little bit of that during the presentation. And then the second part is we take a particular structural development issue and investigate that in a little bit more depth. And usually it's something that we think is a critical area as part of Malaysia's journey to becoming a high-income country over the years ahead. And so the one we're going to present today is about productivity, but we've looked at a whole range of different issues from education, social protection, gender, data, and we're planning to do another couple of editions this year on different topics. So the second half is about productivity. But first of all, we're going to cover the story about recent economic developments, and I think Ulrich has already given us some sort of headlines and introduction to that. But of course, the main story, if you can see behind me, is that we're seeing an acceleration of economic growth in Malaysia's economy. And perhaps almost a somewhat unexpected acceleration, because I think when our team was probably standing where we are about a year ago, we weren't really expecting to see that in 2017 at quite the rate that we've seen. For the first quarter of this year, the economy grew at 5.6%, second quarter even faster at 5.8%. If you look back over the last sort of 8 quarters or so, it's been trundling on around 4 to 5%. So breaking above and significantly above that 5% level is something that we haven't seen for some time. What's driving that growth? Well, interestingly, in fact, it's almost everything. In a sense, you could say if the Malaysian economy was a car, it's firing on all cylinders right now. That's encouraging because it suggests that things are working well. But of course, it also means that we'd only need to see a few things going wrong, and then of course that growth rate would come down to a lower level. It also perhaps suggests that the sort of numbers we're seeing right now are probably close to the maximum potential growth rate of the Malaysian economy right now. And that's a whole separate discussion about, well, what could raise that potential rate of growth. But certainly if you look into the decomposition of growth, which you can see at the back, we're seeing very strong domestic demand and domestic consumption, which is driving growth. Ulrich mentioned we're seeing very strong export performance. Now, of course, in GDP terms, we look at net exports, which is the contribution of exports minus imports. In the first quarter, that was about balanced out, but in the second quarter, that sort of roared into life, where we saw rapid export growth. Of course, imports are still growing very quickly too, but at a somewhat lesser rate. And then perhaps more interestingly, we look at the composition of those imports, and that tells an interesting story. On the one hand, yes, we see that's the corollary of consumption, so Malaysians consuming more, including from abroad, but there's also a strong sense of capital and intermediate imports, which is sort of manufacturers or tomorrow's exports being laid down as we see new investment or reinvestment in Malaysia's core sort of industries. Moving on, perhaps explaining the story in terms of that stability in domestic consumption, we see a very consistent unemployment rate. It hasn't really changed much for the last sort of 3 to 4 years. Similarly, the labor force participation rate has been quite steady, around the sort of 70% mark. Now, of course, that average conceals a very wide range between the male labor force participation rate, which is close to 80%, and the female labor force participation rate, which is around 50%. And that's something we'll perhaps come back to later on when we're looking at the productivity story. Continuing in terms of the current account, there's been a lot of debate in Malaysia over the last few years about what it means to see a gradually narrowing current account surplus. I think there's a lot of different views about what that really means. And from an economist's point of view, we don't perhaps worry so much what the headline number is, but what are the trends going on behind that? What does it mean in terms of the drivers of change in exports and the composition of those and the composition of imports? But certainly in the second quarter, we saw a rebound in the size of the current account surplus, again reflecting that sort of faster growth in exports compared to imports. Similarly, after I think a period of sort of instability last year, we've seen more stability in the ringgit, that depreciating trend, which I think attracted a lot of attention in the media and public opinion, appears to have stabilized. That helps in terms of both consumer and business confidence going forward. And finally, after something of a slowdown in credit growth, we've seen a little bit of a rebound. And again, that again reflects confident consumer demand and clear indication of investment growth in the private sector, although not at the levels that we saw some years ago. Perhaps looking outside Malaysia and trying to understand what are the drivers of this export rebound, it's that faster than expected growth in the world economy. If you look on the left-hand side, we weren't expecting to see stronger growth this year in 2017 for world GDP compared to last year. It doesn't look like much. The middle section is the advanced economies, but growth rates don't really change very much in the advanced economies, and a small increase does have an impact, particularly on tradable goods and services that Malaysia's economy is exposed to. Of course, emerging markets and developing economies are also growing faster than we expected, but that's related to the two, because a lot of the growth for final demand in advanced economies translates into intermediate demand in global value chains that Malaysia is closely integrated, particularly in electronics, electricals, and so on. So the headline story, these are our latest published growth numbers. Ulrich already hinted that we're probably likely to raise our 2017 forecast very soon, but officially our projection remains at the moment 4.9% GDP growth in 2017. We consider that to be a substantial acceleration on the 2016 performance of 4.2%, and probably somewhat sort of sustained performance around that sort of number, around 5% over the next couple of years. So in summary, we see an improved macroeconomic outlook, but clearly there are risks on the horizon and something that policymakers and members of the private sector should be concerned about over the medium term. Perhaps most significantly, Malaysia is a very open economy and so exposed to any changes in international conditions. Policy uncertainty in advanced economies could certainly have an impact very quickly in some of those sectors that Malaysia's export economy is dependent on. One of the big risk factors that we have been highlighting for some time now, of course, is a faster than expected slowdown in growth in China. Malaysia is very closely linked to the supply chains that are affected by Chinese final demand. And of course, we're all watching the Korean Peninsula. So far, that sort of geopolitical events haven't translated into changed sort of economic behavior, but it's entirely possible that they could. And again, that would likely affect a number of economies in this region, including Malaysia. Perhaps also on the fiscal side, we all know one of government's key objectives over the last few years has been to close that ballooning fiscal deficit that opened up when oil prices dropped some years ago. That target has been 3% fiscal deficit. If growth is growing a little bit faster, the likelihood of that target being achieved has probably gone up, and perhaps there's even a little bit of space to overshoot in terms of closing that gap. So maybe I can move now on to the real main course, if you like, which is the productivity discussion after the economy. And so perhaps I should highlight, this is something we worked on for quite some time, and using a range of data sources, we compared Malaysia and Malaysian manufacturers and services firms with equivalents across the world. We had a survey of 1,000 enterprises in Malaysia, a representative survey, where we had detailed information on sales, cost of sales, performance, productivity, and business environment constraints. And we used that to compare with about 150,000 similar survey entries for manufacturing and services firms right across the world in about 140 different countries. And essentially, that's the analysis that we undertook this piece of work on. If you want to do the same, you can actually go and download the data yourself. You just go to www.enterprisesurveys.org, and you can have a look at those numbers and do whatever you like with them as well. And we'd encourage you to do so and tell us what you think too. So perhaps going back to Ulrich's burger analogy, we tried to deconstruct growth into its three principal components, which essentially is labor, capital, and TFP. So labor essentially is how much of an economy grows by people who perhaps weren't working before, entering the workforce, and joining in a productive activity. Particularly for developing countries who are gradually going through a transition, often from low productivity activities like subsistence agriculture into a modern economy, manufacturing and services, that's where a big source of growth comes from. Secondly, there's capital, and that's of course investment in new capital, machinery, equipment that allows the workforce to be more productive and more active. And then finally, we try to capture this animal called TFP, total factor productivity. Already mentioned it, we measure it as the residual because it's very hard to capture. And essentially, it's that bit left over, which shows, well, if you had more people working and they had more equipment, but they were still able to produce even more than we thought, it's because they're being more efficient. And that's what productivity is all about. One thing that we notice over the last few years is that that sort of effort to improve efficiency has become more erratic and perhaps harder to find. It's easy if you go back in economic history terms, and I know a lot of people in Malaysia like to talk about industrialization 4.0. If you go back to those early stages of 1 or 2.0, where you had the advent of steam power and electric power, it's very easy to conceptualize how sort of new technologies and new ways of working allows people to be much more productive. And there's an argument that perhaps that the advanced economies are struggling to find new gains in that sort of way. The iPhone might be a great tool, but does it really transform production in the same way that the steam engine or electric power did? There's an argument that doesn't quite add as much, even though it's a sort of desirable consumer product. But more interestingly, let's focus on Malaysia. So this chart shows essentially the contribution of these three elements, capital, labor, and productivity, over various periods of time for Malaysia. And there's perhaps sort of two takeaways from this chart, if you like. Firstly, the big part of Malaysia's growth has been what we call factor accumulation. So that's more people entering the workforce and more capital investment going on. Now that's entirely natural. That's what the development process is and what you would expect to see in any well-performing developing economy as it goes through that transition, as Malaysia has done from low income to lower middle to upper income, middle and almost to high income. But there are diminishing returns to that strategy. There's only so many more people who can enter the workforce. Eventually, as you approach closer to the capital frontier, the incremental gains from new investments start to tail off unless there's some sort of productivity or gain in efficiency that comes from that. And certainly, we don't see a rising trend in terms of that productivity gain from Malaysia. Secondly, you think, what on earth happened to that second column, which essentially is the period around the Asian financial crisis, which sort of was an enormous disruptive influence on Malaysia, as it was in many other economies in the region. I think our tendency as economists is to focus on the stock market and the exchange rate and all those sorts of financial indicators. But actually, it had a very big impact on the real economy and on manufacturing and productivity through the sort of changes in demand and that shock recession that came as a result. The next slide shows Malaysia sort of compared to some comparators, and these are the numbers that Ulrich mentioned. On the left-hand side, you can see Malaysia, the contribution of productivity growth there is 1.8%. It's significant, but it falls below Korea and Singapore, which are two benchmarks. Really, we would expect Malaysia to be growing at a faster rate, to be catching up with those countries who are sort of further down the road in terms of income levels. And certainly, we don't see a lot of convergence with the upper middle income average, not a lot, and actually falling behind the average for the whole of East Asia altogether. And so the next few slides are trying to understand, well, what might that be the reasons for that slow growth in productivity, and what might be the solutions to try and increase that rate of productivity growth. So this next slide essentially shows what the development process looked like. So each of these bubbles shows the different parts of the economy. The size of the bubble represents how important it is. Essentially, and this is for the period, the early period of Malaysia's development journey from the 1990s. And on the horizontal axis, we have changes in employment, and the vertical axis, changes in productivity. And essentially what we're looking for, and most sort of successful developing countries look like this. And what does it mean? Maybe I should go and stand over here. What does it mean? Well, this is this transition, if you like, out of agriculture, which is relatively low productivity, So because the agricultural bubble is over here, people are moving out of agriculture and moving into these sectors over here, and higher productivity, so they're further up. So essentially the development journey for any country, but for Malaysia during the 1990s, was movement from bottom left up to top right, transformation from lower productivity activities into higher productivity activities, and principally manufacturing, but there's other things there as well. You know, this is the development process sort of in one chart, if you like. But what happens is we see something very strange happening around from before 1998 and then comparing afterwards. So if you remember here, we have agriculture down there, low productivity, people exiting, manufacturing up here, high productivity, people moving into it. What happens when we fast forward to the last 15 years? We see a very different structure on that same chart. In fact, what we see, manufacturing is still higher productivity. That's where, you know, sort of the greatest returns to economic activity are, but actually reducing employment. In fact, since 1999 until 2014, the number of people who've been working in manufacturing has been reducing. And this sort of changes the equation for Malaysia's development journey, if you like, because we no longer see that transformation, structural transformation taking place at the same rate, people moving out of low productivity activities into high productivity activities. If anything, people moving into wholesale, retail, other activities. Now, you know, you could argue that's perhaps a better quality of life. There are sort of benefits from coming into that type of economic activity, but it's not the same productivity gain as coming from moving into manufacturing. So why does productivity matter? You know, one of the things that we hear from government and from Malaysians a lot of the time is that Malaysia is committed to becoming a high-income economy in the next few years. And so we thought, well, you know, what does that pathway look like? And in fact, well, we didn't look at just high income. We looked at reaching the average of high income economies. Now, high income is about 12,000. Of course, when Malaysia passes 12,000, it becomes the bottom high income economy. So we thought, well, what would be a goal by 2050, which is maybe to be about the middle of high income economies, which is around $40,000 at that time. We estimate that everything grows. And so this is where Malaysia is in 2014. It's about 22% of that, of the current average for high-income economies. That's around, what, $9,000 per capita, something like that, and that the average is around 40,000. So when we consider a few scenarios, well, the baseline scenario is just business as usual. Let's imagine that Malaysia carries on growing at productivity growth of 1.8%. That's what happened over the last 10, 15 years. If it carries on in the future, well, by 2050, Malaysia is around 29% of the high-income country average. Okay, so Malaysia's clearly a high-income economy, but it's not a particularly ambitious goal. I think everyone in the room would hope Malaysia would be much further along the line by 2050. So clearly, doing the same as what Malaysia is doing right now probably isn't going to get us where we want to go over the next 20, 30 years. So what are some other scenarios? Well, firstly, well, what happens if that growth rate is just a little bit higher? 2.3%. Okay, it's a little bit higher now than Singapore or Korea. Okay, that helps. 39% of the high-income country target average. A little bit better. Next one was, oh, well, maybe we can try and bring that average of labor force participation up. We mentioned before that there's a big gap in Malaysia between male and female labor force participation rate. Doesn't mean everybody has to work, but if we increase that to the targets set out in the 11th Malaysia Plan, I have it on a slide here, but it's, I think, about 10% higher than it is now. Okay, we're nearly halfway there. The final scenario is perhaps the one that I think we should all be aiming for, which is much more rapid investment in human capital formation. And we talk a little bit more about that in the report, about what that means. But it shows that, you know, productivity is important, but Malaysia needs to also focus on a lot of other things if these sort of goals of development are going to be achieved over the next 20, 30 years. And maybe just to explain a little bit more, so that labor force participation rate, I think the target in the 11th Malaysia Plan, there we are, is around 60%. It's still still well below that at the moment. And investment, particularly in human capital and skills development, is still is less than some of the historical averages over the medium term. Of course, we're again trying to understand, well, what happened in the last few years to explain this sort of slow rate of productivity growth. One thing that we did see in the last few years has been, until I would say this year and perhaps last year, fairly slow growth in demand for tradables and export products, of which Malaysia and a lot of the economies in this region are closely exposed to. And sort of faster growth in employment over sales growth has led to fairly sluggish productivity, and in fact declining productivity in the last 2 years. So what do we see in the last 2 years? We're now only talking in a much more shorter period of time. Is perhaps two interesting stories. One, and perhaps I didn't put that slide on, but the difference between large firms and small firms in terms of their productivity is enormous. I think large firms, and particularly manufacturing firms and those who are exporters, is around 10 times higher than firms who serve the domestic market. But even those large firms and those exporters have seen falling productivity in the last 2 to 3 years. We can break it down into exporter and non-exporter, and you can see it again here, although essentially that's because large firms are exporters. Small firms tend to be serving the domestic market. And again, when we compare across countries, we see something very striking, which is the range of productivity for Malaysian firms is incredibly wide. If you try to imagine here, so we're looking at the average productivity. Okay, here's Malaysia, and it falls below the high-income average, I think a little bit higher than ASEAN, but this incredible range. So if you imagine, this is the 75th percentile up here. These Malaysian firms are world beaters. So there's a core of Malaysian firms that are exceptionally productive and performing incredibly well, but then these guys down here are the other end of the scale. And this is something we're trying to understand, because why is that range so high? Why do you, in one economy, with the same tax rates, the same incentives, the same infrastructure, we have such extreme range of performance across firms? And we have a few ideas, but I'm interested to hear what you think as well. And perhaps just to explain, part of that is, again, this sort of large and small firms. Large firms in Malaysia, the average is high, although the range is still high too. Small firms tend to be much less productive. And exporters and non-exporters, although perhaps, as I said before, it's partly the same issue, because in Malaysia, large firms tend to be exporters, small firms focusing on the domestic market. And we don't see much narrowing of that gap. Again, between the sort of the top and the bottom percentiles, over the last 10 years, that gap hasn't really changed. So perhaps there's something structural in the Malaysian economy which has been like that for quite a long time, which doesn't apply the same competitive pressure to all firms in the same way. Finally, we've been talking a lot about manufacturing, but the services story is not so different, although it's much harder to calculate and estimate productivity of services. You can't tell, for example, the quality of a haircut in the same way as you can a semiconductor. We try, but we're also very sort of conscious that it's very a basic estimate. But it's not a totally different story in the services sector. So what drives productivity? And I'll try and get to the end fairly soon. But research, and when we look in other countries, is 4 main drivers: skills, infrastructure, innovation, and efficiency. And we try to look at these 4 building blocks in Malaysia to try and get to the bottom of what's good and perhaps doesn't need to change, and where there are gaps that could need to change. So starting off with skills, this is our first potential culprit. When you look at the share of secondary educated workers in the Malaysian industry, it's actually very high. It's higher than many other sectors, which suggests that the basic underlying education system is working pretty well. I mean, people go to school and the workforce benefits from that. Although perhaps one worrying sign is that the average number of years of education is not higher. And this seems a little bit of a difficult to explain result, but perhaps what it does suggest is that while people might cover the basics in education, they don't actually stay all the way, and maybe that affects sort of productivity and performance in the workforce, which suggests you need to look a lot closer at actually what people are learning in schools and what kind of skills are they acquiring, rather than just who went to school and what does that mean. Secondly, when we compare vacancy rates across firms in Malaysia with some other countries, they're not particularly high, but then Malaysia firms say and consistently report that it's harder to fill vacancies, particularly in skilled categories compared to other countries, which suggests perhaps more in Malaysia than in other countries around the region. There's a gap between what the workforce wants and what they're finding, there's a gap between what employers want and what they're finding in their workforce, which again perhaps speaks to a gap in skills and a constraint on productivity growth in that particular area. And perhaps surprisingly, we see very little or much less likelihood for Malaysian firms to offer training compared to some comparators. And it sort of brings to mind an anecdote, and I'm not sure who said it, but there was a famous business owner who was talking about he worries that if he trains his workforce, they'll go and work for somebody else and he'll lose them. And then the other business owner said, well, I worry more that if I don't train my workers and they stay with me, it'll be even worse. And certainly you see a sort of, particularly smaller firms, perhaps unable or less willing to offer training, or relying on larger firms and then sort of gaining from spillovers or recruiting workers from outside. But certainly a little bit of a mismatch in this market in that you see supply of skills not meeting demand, and then the market sort of unable to correct that by perhaps improving the in-service skills requirement to meet that demand. And we do see a link, particularly for smaller firms, that those who do provide training do seem to get a productivity boost from that. But perhaps there's something of a market failure in the sense that maybe the gains are externalized and difficult for the firms to make that investment and capture the gains. So going back to our four culprits, skills certainly seems to be one of the top ones. What about the next one, innovation? Well, actually here it's a little bit of a mixed story, because certainly it seems that there is evidence that firms who undertake more innovation activities in terms of adopting and adapting new technologies and new approaches do get an impact from that. But the types of innovation undertaken in Malaysia seem to be mostly what we call non-technical innovation. That's new ways of organizing the workforce, sort of new sales channels, new ways of communicating with customers or supply chains and so on. Often associated with digital technologies and social media, but a lot less on technical innovation, which is introducing new products and completely new sort of capital and methodologies and so on. So perhaps a little bit of a mixed story, but maybe not quite the same culprit compared to our skills in the top left. Infrastructure, the fourth one. What do we see here? Well, actually, the left-hand side shows an index of infrastructure from the World Economic Forum, and the right one is our data from the Logistics Performance Index. As I think you probably all know, Malaysia is not doing too bad on this measure. Now, there are still issues perhaps around the cost of that infrastructure. For example, we know broadband penetration is extremely high in Malaysia. Access is really good, but the cost is a lot more, say, compared to Singapore and some other markets in the regions. I think there are issues, again, possibly around the service and frequency in ports, but this doesn't appear to be an enormous barrier, and Malaysia doesn't seem to be a particular outlier in terms of the quality of infrastructure, at least compared to some of the other issues. So back to the fourth one, efficiency. And well, what exactly does that mean? So again, we try to look at some of the sort of costs of doing business, how much time and energy and financial cost do firms spend dealing with regulations, dealing with government, complying with permits and requirements. And it doesn't seem to stand out particularly high. We look at how long it takes to get an import license, how long it takes to get operating licenses, meeting with government officials. Doesn't seem terrible. It sort of lines up with Malaysia's doing business ranking. I think Malaysia's number 18, something like that, this year. So it doesn't necessarily seem to be in enormous trouble. Although we see a very disparate position between small, medium, and large firms. Again, maybe this speaks to the slightly different operating environment that small, domestically oriented firms versus large exporters face. But perhaps, some evidence that senior management in large firms is spending a lot more time dealing with regulation. That doesn't necessarily need to be a completely bad thing, because we know regulation is important in some areas, protecting basic workers' rights, health and safety, and so on. But we would worry if that sort of starts to reach a level that distracts from core businesses of what businesses do. And when we ask firms, well, what's the biggest problem that you have? We do get an interesting picture, because it doesn't look like in most other high-income economies. Now, you can't see this one at the end. If you could see the whole text, it would say practices of competitors in the informal sector. Essentially, what that means is that an astonishingly high 30% of firms in Malaysia complained about having to compete with other firms who don't follow the rules. Now, that often is sort of mixed up with, where is corruption along here? It's often mixed up in other developed countries around corruption, because people who don't follow the rules and get away with it are usually able to do so because they do something else. Which is, perhaps an indication of one of the challenges. It's not fair if you spend all the time complying with the rules, paying your taxes, and you feel someone else is selling at a lower price in your market and not doing that. Licenses, permits, and that sort of thing. Again, very interestingly, much less likely to complain about tax rates, but more likely to complain about tax administration. That's the sort of opposite of what we often see in high-income or OECD economies. I'm interested to hear your views on how you see that and what that perhaps means for you in the private sector. Interesting as well, access to finance, much lower level of constraint identified in Malaysia compared to some other countries. And that's essentially the same slide. We see fewer financially constrained firms in Malaysia. In most countries where we do this survey, access to finance is the #1 constraint, certainly at the low-income level. So interesting that it's not the principal constraint here in Malaysia. So conclusions, and this is the last slide. I'm sorry, it's been a long meal. So what do we see? Well, a sort of mixed story with productivity. And particularly since 2008, we seem to see this structural break and a much slower rate of productivity growth. We're trying to disentangle. Part of that is just, after the Asian financial crisis, it did take quite a long time for demand for tradables and products of that sort to recover. We're starting to see that now, this year and last year, but it has affected the demand for those sorts of products and has an impact on how we measure productivity. I think perhaps the most striking story is this divergence within firms within Malaysia, because it suggests if some firms can be exceptionally productive, then the core elements to make those firms productive are already present in Malaysia. So the challenge is, how can we bring that average up to the best that Malaysia already has? What it perhaps suggests as well that there's some inefficiency or misallocation of resources. Certainly the suggestion would be perhaps if large firms are so much more productive than small firms, well, why are some of those smaller firms continuing to exist? Perhaps people would just be better off if there was more competition and perhaps some sort of reorganization of factors of production around the more productive firms. Most importantly, it suggests perhaps there's some barriers to competition, particularly in the domestic market, that firms are unable to compete and exploit those productivity gains to increase market share and perhaps push some of the less productive firms out of business. Across our sort of 4 drivers of productivity, so education, on the one hand, the sort of average levels and the basics are right, but there's an argument that perhaps if Malaysia wants to move up to the next level of development, sort of out of lower middle, upper middle income economy into a high income economy, then this becomes more important. And it's not about how many people go to school and how many years, but exactly what type of skills are there and equip them to undertake economic activities in a high income economy setting. Reasonable evidence of innovation, but perhaps some issues about the technical versus non-technical innovation. Infrastructure compares well. But again, this sort of issue of misallocation and resources possibly linked around regulations and competition in key markets. Finally, of course, closing the gap with high-income economies requires not just rapid productivity growth, but also maintaining those traditional growth drivers, particularly human capital formation, which really is the sort of secret ingredient about transitioning from middle income to upper income economies. Thank you very much. We look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Record. Ladies and gentlemen, to continue on with our meal, we would now like to invite our distinguished panelists on stage for the forum and dialogue. The panel discussion will be led and moderated by Penang Institute's Chief Communications Officer and Acting Head of Economics Program, Mr. Tim Nicholas Schwab. Joining him on stage are Mr. Faris Haddad Zavos, Associate Professor Dr. Teo Wing Leong, Puan Rauzah, Zainal Abidin, and Dr. Heng Hak Lee. Over to you, Mr. Schwab.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for the World Bank to serve us a very interesting, let me say, filling main course. I hope that this panel discussions, and it's actually a good tradition in Penang Institute, that we open up to the floor to questions and answers. So I would like to engage you in our dessert tonight to have a closer look and raise questions and issues which you actually think are important when it comes to the state of the nations, the state of the economy, and when it comes to productivity growth. Of course, please raise your questions. I was very interested in listening, of course, to Richard's presentation, and it was mentioned that Malaysia is a very open economy. Of course, we as Penang Institute always have a look or a close look on Penang as well, and we can say that Penang actually is even more open than Malaysia in general. So our balance of trade is very high. We are a big contributor to the country's balance of trade. Penang is a manufacturing powerhouse in Malaysia's economy, and a manufacturing hub not only for global MNCs, global companies, but also, of course, for a very diverse and thriving local SME community. When productivity growth comes to my mind, of course, it should raise maybe the incomes of the citizens as well, so that might be a future potential questions we can raise now as well. So what does that actually mean for each and every one of us? Because if the pie or the economic pie grows, that creates actually a larger piece for everyone in the country. When we put together the panel, we thought it would be good to look at it from different angles. So we are very happy that we have, of course, the World Bank here, as I mentioned earlier. We're very happy to have a local entrepreneur and representative of the business community, the local business community here in Penang. We're very happy, of course, to have also a representative from a federal authority, which are actually trying to boost the productivity in the country. And of course, we are very happy to have an academic as well, so we try to cover all angles. Before we start, maybe let me shortly introduce the panelists to you. So of course, we start with the lady this evening. Mrs. Rauzah is a director for the productivity development at the Malaysian Productivity Corporation. And we are very, very happy, as mentioned, that you came all the way from Kuala Lumpur here to this beautiful island in the north to Penang. We have Dato Heng Hak Lee. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Globetronics Technology Berhad. He graduated from USM a few years ago and obtained an MBA from East Asia University. Dato Heng is very well known in Penang, especially, of course, because he was the president or previous president of FRIPENCA. For those who are not from Penang, it's the Free Industrial Zone Penang Companies Association. And he served as the president from 2011 to 2015. And currently, he's still a committee member of MIDA's E&E Strategic Council, FRIPENCA, as mentioned, Penang Industry Advisory Panel, the US M Industry Community Advisory Panel, and the University Tunku Abdul Rahman Industrial Advisor. Very busy man. Of course, we are very happy to have you, Faris, here. Faris Haddad Servos is the country manager for Malaysia, based in Kuala Lumpur. He is a US national and joined the World Bank also a few years ago. He was at the mission in Iraq, in West Bank, Gaza, country manager for Bolivia. He served as the deputy head of the Quartet office based in Jerusalem. And he obtained his, he's a visiting lecturer on economic development in conflict stage at Georgetown University and Johns Hopkins University. He has a master's degree from George Mason University and a master's degree in finance from George Washington University. So you saw the world. And of course we... No. And of course we are very happy to have you, Prof. Theo, here, all the way from Kuala Lumpur. It's your first trip to Penang. Sorry, I have to mention this. You're currently the head of School of Economics at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. And you received your PhD also in Johns Hopkins University. And you previously taught at the National Taiwan University. And your research interest includes macroeconomics, international finance, and monetary economics. You have been an academic visitor to the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, the City University of Hong Kong, as well as a consultant for the Central Bank of China, Taiwan. So please give everyone a big applause. So I would suggest that I have prepared a few questions. So let me start with a question first, which might be of interest, but please interrupt or raise your hand when you have something which urges you very, very well. So, Faris, maybe I start with you. So, economists often say structural reforms are key to boosting productivity. So, what are some concrete examples of such reforms and what are their potential downsides? Maybe you can also take it from an angle on a state level. So, what in a Penang term, in a Penang environment, because of course many of us are very interested to hear it from that angle. Please.
Thank you very much. I know that's, well, really appreciate being here. I think, you know, the answer, I'm sort of in formulating it, an answer, I'm trying to not repeat on many of the things that my colleagues, Ulrich and Richard, had referred to, but basically looking at the Malaysia context, and then within that, obviously Penang, there is diversity within the whole country. You know, some of the issues, let's say if we start from the objectives, and the objectives, you know, given the story that was laid out by the bank, is to sort of tackle this issue for better or for worse, or whatever it is, this concept of total factor productivity. I think total factor productivity currently remains the best indicator of productivity. So the issue is, if we look at the objective of tackling TFP, there's another issue, which is a female labor force participation, and that is something also my colleague had referred to in the macroeconomic section. So that's another objective. The continued investment in physical and human capital, and realization of the ambitions of Malaysia itself, because we hadn't really referred to this, and I know many of us may have different views on planning models, etc., but there is a vision, a perceived vision of the country in terms of the 11th Malaysia Plan and things of that sort. So if you take those four together, you know, I would argue that there is sort of a mythology that is developed that productivity has to come at the expense of something else, tackling productivity. Actually, I think in tackling these things, these productivity enhancing measures, there are very little trade-offs, obviously, when we talk about labor force participation of these sorts. So one is, if anything I would leave you with is, I think, to dispel the notion that productivity has to come at a short-term cost, because I think even the short-term gains, it's hard for me to imagine what the short-term cost of increasing female labor force participation in the economy is. So that's an option. But some of the key priorities, I think before we start with anything, we need data. We need the right data. We need granular data. And I think in the absence of that, you have no baselines from which to compare and nothing to look forward to. So I think in terms of a policy reform, with frankly little cost, if anything, is the issue of clarity and data. And then moving forward in terms of training, recalibrating skills to meet the, the needs of the economy. Now, where Penang, I think, and other states are moving very much in that direction in terms of skills training with, very laudable institutions such as PSDC and things of that sort, I think you're tackling this issue. And I think it's a wonderful example, a model that can be used in other countries, in other states, certainly in other countries. So I think you're doing, but skills is also a key priority in terms of reform. And we focus on infrastructure. We often say infrastructure is very important. Infrastructure without the software means very little. If we have wonderful roads and the roads stop at the end of the road and there's no clear customs procedures between countries and clear bondage rights and things of that sort, it's also very impactful. So I think matching the software with the hardware and the issue of R&D ecosystems. My colleagues, Richard, and then I'll stop at that and let my other colleagues speak. But Richard alluded to this issue that's often we refer to, changes in the way we market things, changes in our business plan, we refer to as innovation, but that is not really innovation. I think really understanding and developing a clear picture of what innovation is and rationalizing. At the federal level, I don't mind saying this is not a secret, there's over 200X different initiatives for R&D that are being financed. So the idea is to look at those, which are the ones that are really impactful, which are the ones that are working and that are targeting the beneficiaries, and I think taking it from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I would like to ask Puan Rauzah if you could comment on that, because getting an idea from a Malaysian authority would be very interesting.
When you mentioned about the questions about how structural reforms helps to boost productivity, so what it means by structural reforms implies the way the government works. Okay? That's what it meant by talking about structural reforms to boost productivity. So that looks into the regulations. That looks also into whether the regulations that the government has put in is still relevant for the current situation to make the industries to be competitive. So they have to look at some of the regulations that needs to be scraped off, some of the regulations that need to be looked into. Okay, so these are things that we are doing in order to create a conducive business environment for the businesses. And this is what we talk about regulatory reform. Well, regulatory reform for Malaysia is still, I would say, as compared to OECD countries, is still new. Although we have started with talking about collaboration with the public and the private sectors way back in 2005. This is where we set up Pemuda. Pemuda is actually a platform whereby the industries, because as a government, we are trying to give the best. But we don't know what is the best for the industry. So we have this Pemuda as a platform whereby the industries will provide information, what are the issues they are facing with the government regulations. So we have the Pemuda, whereby in 2005 we started that, and it's still in existence and still active until now. And then under the new economic model, this is where we set up our regulatory reform. Okay? We have the setting up regulatory review department in MPC. So we have done lots of projects. Of course, the projects are, I would say, case basis. So we have projects, for example, with Huge Bagel in Johor, whereby we help them in terms of I would say, overcoming the barriers of regulations they are facing in importing products from Singapore to their vendors. And then we have introduced the good regulatory practices. So this is where regulatory reforms are looking at how MPC is working with the government to change the way we are doing things. Okay? So it's a challenge actually, whereby to get the whole of government to change because of because of the history. So, and to make the government to understand the things that the global world that's changing, the support that the industries require from the government in terms of regulation. Because for government, regulations is actually, the objective is to protect the community, is to protect the citizen, is to protect the country. Okay? So there has to be a balance in terms of protection for the society and in terms of making having a conducive business environment to make the industries to be competitive. So it's a challenge to get this balance. And in order to get the balance, so one of the processes is through what we call consultation. So the challenge we are facing for us to get a proper consultation is getting the industries to give feedback. So maybe due to history, they say there have been so many issues, they have been complaining, but there's no resolve in terms of whatever the issues that have been raised. So that could be history. Okay? But things are changing, so so public consultation is very important, and government is providing that platform in whereby whenever we want to review the regulations, whenever we want to look at what are the regulations that we need to look into that needs to be, I would say, guillotine. So we need that consultation. So we need that, I would say, two-way communication between the industries and the government. But there's lots of, I would say, initiative that have been done by the government. It's only there in terms of getting the whole of government to be involved in terms of the regulatory reforms.
Thank you very much, Puan. Maybe before we go into microeconomic analysis with you, Dato, maybe we ask Prof. Teo about what you would have to say on structural reforms, what could boost productivity.
Okay, thank you. So Mr. Faris has mentioned about some of the policy that is needed in Malaysia, and one Rauzah has mentioned about from the government point of view, what should things Malaysia needs. So for me, structural reform is a really broad term. It can mean any change in policy, any way that we have been doing business as usual for the past, and what we need to change in order to bring about a better performance. So some example of structural reform, it can be anything from like what China has done to liberalize its economy, what India has done to liberalize its economy, and we have seen that with proper policy, you can bring about very huge improvement in your growth rate. Now, in the context of Malaysia, of course, we are facing quite a bit different scenario compared to China or India used to have before. Now, we are not as close as them before, but we are constantly being talked about as being in a middle income track. We are having difficulty moving into a higher value added industry type of things. Now, for me, of course, there are issues like skills that Dr. Rakat has mentioned just now, like mismatch between what the industry need and what we are producing in terms of our graduates, and also in terms of the labor force participation rate. Now, of course, as a Malaysian, as a KL person who has never visited Penang before, my own personal experience is that living in Malaysia, we are in a situation that many females feel that they are not comfortable participating in the labor market, even though they have graduated with university degree. Maybe they feel that either they feel like they want to stay at home to take care of the children, or because they feel that the environment is such that they are not really feeling comfortable leaving their children to be taken care by nannies or foreign laborers. So there are things that we need to do in order to resolve this problem by encouraging female to participate more in the labor market. Now, of course, there are also other issues that are particular to Malaysia, like how we rely on the foreign laborers, and how in the export market we are dominated by a few large foreign firms, but the trickle down of the skills to local firms are not that much. So all these things are issues that we need to think about, and I think some government agency like MPC, they have been trying to help to bring about changes in this, and World Bank has also contributed by giving advice to Malaysia.
Thank you very much. Maybe Dato Heng, now you can share a little bit about your experiences from the private sector, especially being a local company. What are your thoughts on productivity? How can we improve?
Okay, good evening. First of all, let me add on the reform, and from the industry perspective, how are we looking at from the government's perspective towards the reform, and whether there is a mismatch as being mentioned right now. I think one part of the major reform we should be looking at is right from the Malaysian education system. Thank you. Now, I think we take politics out of the education system. Today, from the industry perspective, we have to seriously ask ourselves, is the graduate that is coming out or is the secondary school student coming out ready for the industry or not? And if that reform is not taking place, the productivity will continue to suffer, right? And we are seeing that kind of problem. Certain manufacturing companies are benefiting, certain companies are not. It's because a lot of wastages are actually being done in retraining, reskilling, and actually re-educating many of the so-called graduate that is coming out from our local university and local institution. So I think that is one major part of the reform that we should seriously attack it if productivity were to be addressed, right? So that's one part of it. The second part is I am coming from the technology industry. I've been involved in the semiconductor world and the technology world for the last 35 years. We see China is moving ahead much faster than Malaysia in adoption of technology, right? From the government sector standpoint, from the whole ecosystem standpoint, towards you can have port in China today can be run without any manning. Whereas Malaysia, from the entire system, from the government to the private sector to the cost of doing business, today we are still stuck into a lot of mindset of not able to engage technology and embark on technology. So you ask me about reform, that is another biggest part of the reform. Malaysia as a whole is lagging and we need to really, really seriously look into it, right? So this is my perspective of reform, right? And it's more from my experience, 35 years in the industry, and there are a lot of frustration from the industry perspective. There's a lot of feedback. One, you talk about engagement. There have been a ton of engagement. But then I think sometimes we need to get beyond the political commitment for this change. If we do not break through this barrier, I think there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of engagement, and the lot of communication, but it go to waste. So that is my personal opinion about it, right? So from industry standpoint, I capture a very good indicator from you, right? There is a vast divergence between certain good companies demonstrating very good productivity growth versus some manufacturing sector that are not delivering very good manufacturing indicator in terms of productivity. I think this goes back to more than just the 4 key drivers you just talked about, right? We talk about, from the industry standpoint, we talk about you want to drive productivity more from, in the industry term, we call 4M, right? You look at human capital. That was the skill part of it. We look at the machine. That is the investment part of it. But there are a lot of process that go into it. There's a lot of material engineering that go into it that come probably from the innovation, right? So the 4 aspect of the factor, I think we agree. But then how each industry respond to these 4 factors play a very important part in delivering the final outcome. So I think Malaysia will continue to look at the divergence because there are certain good companies believe in investing in these 4 main factors. There are some that are going to be questioning themselves and say, look, this productivity come at an upfront investment as capital and it's very hard to justify. So it will come to a certain point from the industry and market force standpoint, you are forced out of no choice. For survival, you have to do it. But unfortunately, by then it's too late. So probably that is the start of what my thought about productivity, you know. We can discuss more about it later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And actually, this is something which we hear a lot when we talk to the companies as well. Maybe it should be a mixture between public initiatives, what we heard from Rauzah, but maybe it should also be some commitment from the industry itself. And taking a look at Penang's economy, we have, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of MNCs. They are very strong competitors on the labor market in Penang because they come with big incentives and education programs, and the local companies actually, and this is what we always advise, should take this opportunity as well to invest in the people because the competition on the labor market, the unemployment rate is very low in Penang, it's very, very strong, and I think if we want to boost especially the local companies, we have to convince the people and to convince the community to really invest in skills, to not being too dependent on the MNCs, but living beside the MNCs who are operating in Penang. This is actually very important. I would like to ask the floor if there is already a question. Do you have any questions? The gentleman here. And maybe you can introduce yourself. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is Murugapan. I would like to thank Penang Institute for holding these regular talks. My question is with regard to GDP. Now, we are all given an optimistic picture about GDP growth in Malaysia. I presume that the World Bank depends on statistics provided by the Department of Statistics. Now, if you look at the GDP figures, obviously when you compare, you must compare with prices some time ago. So there needs to be a GDP deflator so that you can make it comparable. Now, what is the GDP deflator? Is it the CPI? Most people would agree, even though there is no solid evidence, that the government CPI is not accurate. Most people estimate that the inflation figure is around 8%. So the very fact that you use perhaps 3.2% to deflate the GDP gives a wrong picture about GDP growth. Now, the second question is that because it is all measured in ringgit terms, what is the contribution of the depreciating ringgit? Because you are calculating export revenue in depreciating ringgit. Does that contribute again to an inflation of GDP growth? And when you talk about productivity growth, according to various ministers, we have 6 million foreign workers, many of whom are not documented. And surely when you do a survey, employers also will not report because these are illegal workers. So are you miscalculating the productivity growth? In fact, I have many other issues, but I think I want to give others a chance as well. The last point I want to make, in spite of all that the government tells us about GDP growth, this and that, in fact, they say the per capita income, if I'm not mistaken, is 4,005. But the EPF says, based on the contributions from employees, the average employee is only earning less than 2,000. Most important, the average person on the ground doesn't feel he's better off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for your very engaging questions. Maybe we should ask the World Bank how the figures came across. What do you have to say?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the question. I think I have an easy answer. Richard did it. So it's anything related to GDP is Richard's fault. But in all seriousness, I think this is a topic. In fact, recently we just actually Richard and I did an op-ed in the papers. We were talking about this issue because there was, as you know, this emerging discussion of GDP, whether it's ringgit or dollars, and what is all of that mean. And you rightly mentioned the issue that, in fact, when we do estimates of GDP, I cannot comment. I mean, I maybe seriously defer to Richard on the issue of the accuracy of the data, etc. But we have some measures to ensure, to the best of our ability, the accuracy. And as you mentioned, when we look at GDP, we hold things that we're looking at real GDP and not nominal GDP. I take your point on CPI. I haven't missed it. It's honestly, I don't have an answer to that. But we do actually, in terms of real GDP, we focus on that, and we're trying to capture things at real prices. Now, this issue that you had mentioned, and I inevitably will answer this partially because I don't have the answer to that. There's a constant sort of discussion, we being the World Bank here, an international organization, talking to all facets of Malaysian society. We hear this issue that, we see GDP increasing, growing, but we're not better off. And I'll be very honest with you, as I think that's a legitimate claim often, and not by yourself, but it's conflated. I see a lot of conflation or a mixing of the issues of inflation versus standard of living. I do think, that what we see here is that people's, that while inflation seems to be under control, people are not seeing their revenues, their wealth, their salaries growing up to the amount of what the economy is growing. So they're saying, well, GDP is going to, is growing 4.9, is going to grow X% in the future, but why is my salary not going? And again, that brings us back to the issue of productivity. In a market, ultimately, and maybe I'm being too purist on this, salary should be wage equals marginal product. And I think focusing on productivity, focusing on a competitive, an even competitive field, focusing on these issues should be ultimately what it is. This issue of the exchange rate and others, it's a very good point. I know many colleagues, and perhaps yourself, sir, and many who have kids, to be honest, who are studying in the US, studying in Australia, and it must be, being a father myself, it must be extremely frustrating to say, look, my money, I can't afford to send them. So that must be very difficult to see that, and at the same time hear all the good news about GDP. That is a reality. I have to be an economist at heart ultimately and say Malaysia is a country that is an open economy, where trade is 150% of GDP. In some cases, let us also be fair and note the importance of the ringgit in terms of making Malaysian products competitive. So it's just a trade-off. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but I think there's a pro and con to everything, and the picture is never black and white. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question? Yes, gentlemen.
Okay, my name is Clifford Tor, first business editor of the Star paper in Malaysia, and semi-retired at the moment. My question is, we talk about productivity and things like that, increase of GDP. When you have achieved a great increase in GDP, you get a fall in the happiness index. Half of the US are diabetic or pre-diabetic. So is there progress actually? Question number 2, we focus too much on labor. Now we have robots. The more robots we have and the better robots that we have, they work for us, they do everything for us. We don't need labor to do anything.
Thank you very much, sir. Maybe we come to the first question. I mean, of course, it's a question, how is it related to the happiness index? How happy are we all? Maybe we can have an academic answer to that. When it comes, of course, to Industry 4.7, 4.0, digitalization, how does the labor look or the production look in the future? Maybe we can ask Dr. Heng later. So, Prof. Teo, how happy are you?
I'm happy to be in Penang. Okay, in all seriousness, the issue about GDP, whether it measures happiness, in academic economics, we well recognize that GDP has its own limitation. Actually, in academic economics, there are now some economists who are doing research on whether we can come up with an index of happiness and what are the factors that actually affect happiness. Now, of course, I do understand that we need to be critical of what GDP is measuring or what GDP growth is actually telling us, and we should not just single-mindedly focus on GDP growth. But the reality is that among all other factors, we still have a large segment of people who are feeling stress in everyday life, and one of the most direct way to help those people will be to have a faster GDP growth. Now, again, I'm not saying that faster GDP growth will necessarily bring you happiness, but to improve on the situation, GDP growth will play a big part. So, for example, the fast GDP growth in China over the last 2 decades have literally lifted billions of people out of poverty. So their standard of living have improved a lot. Now, again, GDP itself is not everything, but it's a big part of our standard of living. I guess that's the part about whether GDP measures happiness, right? So.
Yeah, thank you very much. And the second question, Dr. Heng, do you think that in the future you only employ machines rather than people?
Okay, let me correct that. Just now, I think dimension of Industry 4.0, which imply that there is an industrial revolution that the robot will take over from human being. Now, if I were to speak based on my many years of experience in the industry, based on my recent experience on many of the company in the FIZ, and including the company that I'm involved, this threat and this fear of many Malaysians will be out of job, I would say is negative. In actual fact, we have been trying to hire up to about 500 people. And to be honest with you, we still have difficulty to get Malaysian to work, right? Now, this is not talking about robot or industry automation totally replace the human being. If I were to share with you in the next level detail about what Industry 4.0 all is about, it's actually going to create a lot more knowledge, job contents, job, create a lot of high-skilled job, and require a lot of people that has to be higher educated. Because in order to make the process automated, in order to make the robot work, we need a big team of people to go after the process improvement, to go after the automation, to implement all the various processes so that you'll have less operator. So the fear will be the lower income operator that may lose the job, not the skill, not the technician, not the engineer, and not the manager. So we should be very happy because Malaysia, especially in the electronic sector or the manufacturing sector, we have 40 over years of experience. We have a big pool of people. Today, actually, if you drive Industrial 4.0, this big pool of people from their experience, their knowledge, actually will be put more into better use. And they can produce better productivity rather than we continuously trapped into the manual job. So my personal opinion is, it's unlikely in even the next 10, 20 years, the total workforce is going to be eliminated and replaced by robot, right? Even we have benchmarked certain very good German company, like for example, Infineon in Singapore, spend hundreds of millions to automate their operation. But you know, the process to get there is taking years. And they require so many more engineer, technician to maintain the process. So for robot, for automation to work, we need very good skilled technical people. And today that is again what Malaysia is lacking, right? We are really short of this group of people. So from another angle to look at it, because of lack of this pool of skilled workforce, for Malaysia to implement Industry 4.0, we are hitting actually a lot of hurdle. And I would call it many hurdle and resistant to even implement some basic automation. So that is my opinion. I think I can rest assure you, have very little fear. Not totally zero fear, but little fear that we will be out of job soon. And for all you sitting in this room, we have been very experienced in industry. Actually, we will be adding more value, right? There will be more opportunity coming along the way if Industrial 4.0 were to really take off in Malaysia. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Okay, let me explain about productivity. Actually, productivity at the end of the day is to increase your quality of life. If you were to take the culture of productivity, if you take to inculcate the culture of productivity in the daily work life and also in your work culture, because how does productivity lead to quality of life? Because we're talking about the culture of productivity. One is teamwork. Productivity, to be productive, to be more efficient, less resources, which means you have to work in a team. And in a team, you have various, I would say, types of people. We have one with a very skillful, one with good talent maybe in communication. The other person, we have talent in terms of the technical part, so we have that group. So in an organization, you have to have a lot of teamwork. So teamwork is one way of increasing productivity to make you more efficient. And as mentioned by Dato', another area very important would be lifelong learning. So every employee, as mentioned just now based on the study, our employer, our industries, they are scared of sending their people for training. Okay? You see there's lots of fund under PSMB that's not being used because the employers doesn't want to send their people for training. So you need skilled people. You need to change the mindset of the people. You just cannot depend on the education system. Yes, I do agree that our education system has to be looked into. But you just cannot depend on the education system. You have to, because once they are out of the school system, the employer have to be also to be together with the government in terms of upgrading the skill of the people and changing the attitude and the way of they are doing their work. And so as an employer, I would say, as a director, as a manager, as an employer, you must also create that conducive business environment for the people, so that they will be happy to go to their work, okay? And they are not stressful in doing their work. So productivity is not talking about hard work. It's not talking about long hours of work. You compare Malaysia to Germany, you compare to US. Malaysia, our working hours is about 2,700 hours per year, as compared to US only about 1,007. And their productivity was 6 times higher than us. So it's more of how efficient the way we are doing work is what product is about. That creates to the quality of life.
Yes, please. Please. No, I think I have to also represent the industry to speak along what Puan has just mentioned, 1 or 2 points. Number one, for Puan to say that there are many companies who are not willing or actually scared to send an employee for training is not totally true, right? I think we have to recognize the attitude of Malaysian workforce, right? We want to send some of the people for training. They are reluctant. So it's not the fault of the company, right? I think I have to say fairly to many of the bosses, some of you are here, you know, the attitude of the people, Malaysian, thank you. Malaysian, I call it in the industry that we used to have all the CEO forum, we keep talking. Our workforce to a certain extent are not hungry, right? We have a mindset and attitude problem of complacency and I don't know, getting too satisfied and too complacent and too comfortable with the job. So that is another barrier. I don't know how to change it. We need the psychologists here to talk about it, you know. But there is a real problem, right? Is it inculcated from the education system we have down to the way we are handing out things today? That maybe is some root cause we have to re-study back. The whole structure from every aspect actually is not helping to drive productivity. And this area, like I say, I'm not an expert, but on behalf of the factory, we feel and suffer along with some of these weaknesses we are facing today. Thank you.
Prof. Theo, because you're teaching, of course, in a university, you're engaged with young people. How is your experience? How is your opinion on that?
I actually intend to ask my student to look at the video recording, so I'm thinking what I should say right now. I had experience teaching in Taiwan, so one of the questions that I have often been asked will be to compare the attitude of Taiwanese student compared to Malaysian student. For me, I see some similarity and some differences, but I wouldn't say there is a huge difference in terms of Malaysian student being less progressive or less hardworking compared to Taiwanese student. Now, for me, the current generation of students that I'm facing every day in school, I think they have a different outlook compared to my generation. They are more used to the IT, they are more interested on things that I wasn't that interested in when I was in my university years. But I think, I don't know, I mean, what I face every day as university student, so I don't know whether they are really a representative of Malaysian workers, because if you really look at the data, not a large percentage of Malaysian workers are actually university graduate. Now, but if you are looking at the university student themselves, I would say they're all trying to do something in their life, even though they may not be in the way that instructor want them to be, like focusing more on their studies. But with the information age, with everyone able to search on ways to improve their experience, I think for university graduate themselves or university students themselves, they have a lot of ways to improve on their skills and abilities. In the context of Malaysia, it's more of a question of how many more university graduates that are in demand by the industry can be trained. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have another question?
Yes, I would like to know what Malaysia is doing for the Malaysian who went abroad, and actually they are the skilled one. Those are the fellows who really will travel, which is what our friends find for his work. Because those Malaysians are those who are willing to give the maximum. They are abroad and they are not coming back to Malaysia. Every year we lost 5 to 10,000 of them permanently. And I don't see how Malaysia can become an advanced country by 2050 without them. They are the cream of the society. They spent 13 years in school. Most of them come from international schools. The parents spend thousands of dollars on them every day and every month. And we lost them. So I want to know what Malaysia will do for them and how to get them back, and do we really have a program to welcome those Malaysians abroad to come back to Malaysia?
So brain drain definitely is a big issue in Penang, or in whole of Malaysia, of course, yes.
Because we have the money, but not the skill, not productivity, and travel.
Puan Rauzah, maybe you can say something about.
Okay, talking about the brain drain. Yes, there was a study being done whereby, especially when looking at our neighboring country, Singapore, whereby we have many Malaysians there, especially we have the technicians, they are skilled, okay, they came from the polytechnics, from technical schools, and even you're talking about the aerospace industries, the CEO of the aerospace that belongs to was in Singapore and is a Malaysian. And for the government to attract them to come back, yes, we do have what we call the tax incentive under Talent Corp. Okay, we talk about Talent Corp. There are lots of incentive given by the government to attract this talent to come back. But the issue is that is their placement. They are very talented. They have special skills, but there's no place in Malaysia for them. I mean, for the industries, we cannot find industries that can match their talent, that are willing to accept them. Okay, so that's an issue that we are facing in terms of the industries, because we cannot depend on the government to absorb them, because they have special skills. So you need the industries. So one of the challenge that is faced by Talent Corp in attracting them to come back is placing them in Malaysia, which industries are willing to take them, and for that particular skills that are required, which particular industries require that particular skill. Because as you know, many of our industries, that's why our productivity is low, because of the value add. We have low value add. Many of the industries, of course, there is a big gap, as mentioned by the study, between the large and especially the SMEs. Okay, we put aside the E&E SMEs. They are of different class. They are of higher productivity, and they are one of the highest productivity besides chemical sectors. Because E&E sectors, SMEs are, but relatively you compare to MNCs, they are much lower. Okay. So the issue is that how can these SMEs, our local Malaysian companies, can attract this talent back? So we need that particular skill, we need that particular industries, that high value add industries. And this is what the government is trying, they're talking about productivity. To boost productivity, we need to have high value add industries. And that needs innovation from the industry players.
Okay, can I add on from a different perspective? I'm not an academician or economist, but if I were to speak from my exposure to the technology world, we should not be just confined to looking at attracting the talent coming back to Malaysia. Instead, the government and the country as a whole should open out the whole country and say, can we attract more than just our own nationality to come back to Malaysia? We should become the magnet to attract the world talent, so that our innovation, right, the many creativity that Malaysia is lacking today can break through. One talk about SME being limited, not able to attract these people back. But why can't we look at more than just our own people? No doubt, okay, I like to see all our people coming back. But then if you talk about creativity, you talking about attracting talent, talking about breakthrough, we should not confine to any nationality. So today Malaysia has again a problem of opening up to talent, and many of the companies, you may have gaps or vacancy or certain area that you want to work on, but you don't have the resources. Malaysia does not have. Other country, you maybe have difficulty to bring them in because the government imposed such a restrictive procedure and such a what do I call, barrier resulting in it's almost impossible to bring these people to help to fill the gap that each of the company are facing from every now and then. So I think if we want to break through to higher productivity, maybe we should also think laterally, right? Rather than worry about brain drain, should we attract the people back? What does it take to create the environment? What does it take to open up so that we become the magnet? And that will be the big push. If today we look at why US is such a productive and creative country, because they attract such a high percentage of the brightest people in the world to go there. So now question here is, what does it take for Malaysia to become the place where people or look at Malaysia as the country of choice to come in, the talent. But unfortunately, we attract the wrong type of workforce. So that's why we are in trouble today. Thank you.
Maybe Faris, you can share how does the US do it? So what can Malaysia do to actually achieve it? What does that practically mean?
No, thanks very much. If I may, just rather than the US, I think that's, but I just wanted to focus, if I could take the liberty of noting the Malaysian context a little bit and knowing full well that I've only, certainly myself, I've only been here for 2 years, so I can't claim. One thing I've observed a couple of things. One is, I'm not sure you can necessarily lose Malaysians abroad, because I think you guys are a very patriotic, nationalist bunch, and we certainly have a lot of Malaysian colleagues in the World Bank, and any excuse to come back, I think they'll come. I don't think you're capable of losing any Malaysian outside of Malaysia, which is a nice thing. But I would tend to agree with that. I think looking at it from a perspective of, there's a quote from a famous movie in the US, build it and they will come. And I think really not focusing on whether Malaysian or not. I mean, if you think about it, these Malaysian colleagues that go overseas are bright, they're internationally competitive, they're well educated, and they are hireable outside. And they have a revealed preference to go outside because beyond salary, they face a meritocratic system where they can excel based on their own skills, their own hard work, and they're not impeded. So they have that. So the idea is, how do you create an environment here to do that? So a Malaysian, an American, a Swiss or whatever can come, and then create that. And I think that is the optimal strategy. And then whether the Malaysians come back or it's somebody else, I reckon 8 out of 10 will be Malaysians. But let's not focus on that, because that limits them. Because my humble view is the Malaysian who left because he doesn't want to talk about his Malaysianness and what it means here. He or she wants opportunity, wants a meritocratic system, wants open opportunity to excel and achieve dignity beyond salary, and I think that's what we should focus on.
Thank you very much. We had a gentleman in the back with a white shirt. I think he was first.
Hi, hello. Hi, my name is Top Lim. I actually work for Dell Computers, so I'm an average working Malaysian. And I also like to state that 4 years ago, I had the opportunity to actually work in Singapore, which I actually turned down, and I worked in Penang, and I don't regret it at all. Just one question is on the statistics. I mean, I'm not an economist, and I'm not academic, but I have a big interest in economics and the economy. I see a lot of GDP, and going back to the gentleman here talking about happiness, I mean, apart from the happiness, I think from a technical point of view, things like wealth distribution, inflation, standard of living, I think all that contributes to the productivity of a person, because I think an unhappy worker is an unproductive worker. And I think going back to happiness, linked with many other aspects, do we really want to be that productive like our dear neighbor in the south, Singapore, where they are very productive, but I'm not sure that's the kind of culture that we all want to be in. Like I said just now, if you give me a choice, would I want to go back and work Singapore and make 3 times the money? I don't think so, because I have a great life here. I don't have to line up for food. I have a nice big house, not in an 800 HDB flat. So I think what I'm trying to say is productivity growth always the best? And just now I saw the indicators comparing to East Asia, like Korea, Japan. I mean, do we talk about the suicide rates in Korea? I have many friends who are non-Malaysians living here, working here, who would never want to go back to their country. And these are young, talented individuals from Italy, Korea, well-educated, who would love to live here in our culture in a country. I'm not saying Malaysia is great. There's still room for improvement, but it's increasing the productivity growth and comparing to nations like Korea and all that, the best way to look at things. And just one last thing is, you know, I'm sure the World Bank has a lot of smart people. Are you guys doing anything to kind of deviate from these, you know, normal indicators? Maybe it's the limited time that you have, you're not showing other things, but these indicators to me are very normal and they're not really all that relevant today. Thank you.
Maybe
Thanks very much. Recently, you know, the institution, the World Bank as an institution, we have our own mantras, we have our own vision statement. As most institutions do, private and public. And recently, a few years ago, we actually pondered this issue that you're talking about. Is GDP, I would argue, having a good salary doesn't make you happy, but being poor certainly doesn't make you happy, I can tell you that. So if you're gonna be unhappy, you might as well be unhappy and rich. But having said that, so we really, in all seriousness, we focused on this issue, and you're very right, that it is not a sufficient condition just to have high GDP, etc. This is why the World Bank always talks about its twin goals. We have the twin goals of the institution, which is 1, eradication of extreme poverty, that's goal 1, and goal 2, the shared prosperity. The GDP itself is not sufficient if not everybody partakes in the wealth, and wealth does not have to be money. It could be opportunity, it could be intergenerational, you know, poverty and reduction, intergeneration exit from poverty, just self-realization. So we ourselves, by our twin goals, by the sheer, you know, the words, acknowledge that growth is not enough. What we're seeing in the world, certainly with conflict elsewhere, in my own country, that wealth itself does not translate into happiness, and there's a sense that something is missing out. So if people are not sharing in the aspirations of the collective of the country, it's not enough. So I fully acknowledge that that is something, and this is something that is very serious to us. This is just one measure, of course, but if you look at other issues, in fact, many we have, you know, this is beyond this discussion, but we have multivariate measures of growth. We have multi-generation, intergenerational growth, so we're very much looking at that. This is focused specifically on productivity, but there's a lot of things that we certainly agree with you that this is very important. And the world around us demonstrates that having a high income doesn't necessarily make you safe, prosperous, or even internally happy. I fully agree.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Are you part of the panel?
No, but I think it's a conversation. I think one important point is that what matters a lot is equality or equity, and equity of opportunities. And so one of the things that has actually been a lot of work done on this, it's not just average incomes, it actually is how equitable incomes are distributed and what are the opportunities to have increases in income. And it's been shown, there is a lot of research around the world, and it's relatively recent, that, that two things have been shown. First of all, that if you actually have relatively greater equity of opportunities, actually that by itself helps increase incomes over time. So typically high income growth is not sustainable if it goes at the expense of, you know, ever rising inequality. And the second thing that's been shown is that human beings are constructed, we all are constructed in a strange way. We actually, many of us tend to compare ourselves with our neighbors. We think We think we are free of that, but the truth is, in the heart of our hearts, many of us, you know, do kind of compare ourselves with our neighbors. And so, you know, when we have our own internal sense of fairness and equity, and we have a sense that there is more equity around, we're happier. So there is a saying that more equity means higher income and higher growth, but also more equity, because there's a sense of perception, means greater happiness. And more equity and equal opportunities doesn't mean everybody earns the same thing at all, because some people have more opportunities because they work harder at it. And if we know that person X works harder than me, I'm actually accepting that typically. Anyway, so I think this point on equity is an important one. And I think it's one that in the World Bank and around the world, I think academic institutions and economists have been discovering very late in our professional lives as economists. But, you know, better late than never.
Sorry, just one last thing. Thank you, Ulrich. I had forgotten to mention this because you said, well, we're looking at TFP and factor productivity, and is that enough? But let's remember also that I fully agree with you, but also, for instance, one example is Sweden now. As you know, Sweden, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's Sweden or Finland, it is Sweden, has actually moved to a 6-hour workday. So they actually, due to their vast leaps in productivity, they're working less than we are, and they're actually more productive. So I would argue that if you actually enhance your productivity, you have more leisure time, more time with family, more time with loved ones, and could be happier.
Maybe 3 more questions. Maybe the gentleman here in front.
This one is for Puan. You mentioned about SMEs' reluctance to send their employees for training. I can concur with that. I'm one of the culprits. I managed a metal machining company in the industrial zone for more than 20 years. And there's a reason for that, okay? Maybe I can share it with you later. And to Dato Heng, I think you were formerly from TI, right? Oh, no, from Technical Institute.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, okay. Yep. You know, you mentioned about attitude. Then you should actually talk to Tan Sri Nathan of Eversendai, and who would fully concur with you. But what I want to bring up is, in my 20+ years, you know, in the metal machining industry, none of the top performers actually graduated with a certificate of diploma, right? So when I submitted my proposal for my postgrad, and I was shocked because the proposal was basically vocational education should migrate fully into the hands of private industry, right? Because it makes sense, because I've seen it, you know, people who don't have the paper of qualifications, they outperform the ones with the paper of qualifications. So it makes sense that it just moves fully into the hands of private industry. And my supervisor just said no, without giving me a reason. And conventional wisdom tells you that you don't argue with your supervisor. So I don't know, what are your thoughts about vocational education? Should it be fully in the hands of private industry? For you.
Okay, first of all, I'm more coming from the electronic sector. And if I were to use your example, which I may look at it from a different perspective from my experience standpoint. In 1998, I made my first visit to China. And at that point in time, I have the very famous MD from Intel who moved from Intel Malaysia to Motorola China. In 1998, they told me, during my visit together with my boss, they said, look, the semiconductor industry in China is 10 to 15 years behind Malaysia. That is 1998. I think all of us in this room who are following technology progress will agree that today, China is ahead of Malaysia. Why is this so? So I use back your example as vocational education, plus the kind of deductance or people not sending their people for training, or from the precision industry standpoint. Today we have many similar competitors in China who are even more advanced than Malaysian precision industry. To me, I think it's a very sad situation that we were trapped in the comfort zone. Could it be the skill set being trapped? Could it be the fear of the boss not moving up? Could be the education system. I think all this come all in one together, that China has all this better than us. And if we do not realize this shortfall that we are facing, we will continue to be just one of the supply chain to somebody big. We can never control the final end product, the final machinery, or even be a machine supplier to the top-notch equipment in the world in terms of technology. So your example is good, but example, in my personal opinion, also reflect the kind of mentality we have as a whole in terms of industry, as well as from the government sector, as well as probably the attitude we are too comfortable or we are driven by fear of people leaving us. So I think the moving out, the skill set of our workforce, the introduction of the right training, right knowledge, and the exposure to all the latest technology. Actually, we have the best advantage of the ecosystem, because 40 over years ago, we have the best company in semiconductor investing in Malaysia. But instead of we moving out as fast as them, we got trapped into certain middle level in our capability, and today we are at best as just a component supplier. And yeah, there are few breakthroughs, but as a whole, I think as an industry as a whole, we were actually behind the curve. That's my personal opinion. So both the government institute as well as the private sector should lead the vocational training as well as the technical training. That's my personal opinion. Thank you.
So, two more last questions. Maybe the lady in the back. Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm Wensi. I'm from an MNC company based in Penang. I would like to ask simple questions about our education system right now. I don't know if any of you have the statistic about the current education system and how many technical graduates our country has produced, so that we can close up the gap, you know, the mismatch between the industrial expectation and what we can produce from our education system. And how many percent of our graduates are actually from technical or vocational field? Yeah. So I see this in my company, and we have been getting a very tough time, you know, in getting engineers. Engineers, you know, the turnover rate are very high, and it's in this industry is very small. We are pinching from one industry to another industry. The engineers just hop around. So it's very limited pool of engineers right now. Yeah, so what are we going to do in an education perspective? Any help, you know? Because I think right now, you know, technicals, I mean, our education system focus on the technical side is very limited. I would say that. It's very crucial right now, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
This is based on our analysis, and we are using the international standard. We're talking about skill, whereby we're talking about skill is looking at upper secondary, going for diplomas or higher institutions. And basically from our data set, at the industry level, we only about 15% are considered as skilled, which means they are of higher level from higher institutions. About 70% are those with SPM. Okay? So which means our industries are employing a lot of those with SPM rather than graduates. Okay, this is basically on the average. Yeah? So in terms of looking at the unemployment, we find that a lot of unemployment are among the graduates. So, so the issue, where is the gap? And we are talking about engineers. We have many engineers that are being unemployed. So I think the problem is in terms of the mismatching will be in terms of the skill that is required. You are an engineer, but do you have the skill that meets the demand of the industries? Maybe that's the issue that we are facing. And we are looking at the government, yes, that was maybe, you can say, history about 20, 30 years ago, whereby we don't focus on technical, vocational. But now I think what the government is doing, there's lots of emphasis on technical and vocational. Maybe it's a matter of time. Maybe you have to wait for another 5 years to get this new batch of graduates. But, okay, it's too long, I know. You can't wait for that. Okay, but what we are doing is that to fill up this gap, we have this, what we call the institutions. The current institutions, the higher institutions, the agencies that is providing these services. Now it's a matter of whether the industries are coming over to the institutions to get these services. For example, you have PSDC, for example, in Penang, and you have lots of these institutions, not only among the universities, but lots of colleges that is offering programs to meet this mismatch in terms of the skill required by the industries. So I think the issue is the supply and the demand, whether you have the demand but you don't know where to go. And the institution, they have the supply but they don't know where to supply all this the talent. So I think there's a gap in there. So maybe I will tell later about our way forward in terms of boosting productivity of the nation. Different ways of doing things.
No, I'm not sure I can agree with Puan on the statistic that many of the engineers are employed. I think from the industry standpoint, it's truly we are short an engineer, we are short a technician. So we will be very happy that you can tell us where to get this unemployed engineer. You know? Now, going back to the fundamental, I sit in the council, the strategic council with MIDA, looking into the E&E, the future development of E&E, that means electrical industry. One of the fundamental that we think the Malaysia is facing right now is the number of students from even the secondary school level to the university level that chosen to be involved in science and technology is shrinking. So that is one of the major problems right now. All you here may be parents to one, two, or many kids. We did not play the role to encourage them to take up science. So that is one part of the problem. The second part of the problem that when the study we have been arguing in the council, the process to earn a degree in science, engineering, and technology are relatively harder to deal with mathematics, to deal with advanced mathematics, to deal with applied mathematics, to deal with all kinds of formula. I think that is not the top choice of many of the youngsters nowadays. So there is a problem. That is one of the major problems that we are facing from the youngsters do not choose this as their favorite subject, right? And now I think from the government standpoint, which I think the state government is taking a lead, right, to come up with what they call STEM, science, technology, right, English and mathematics as one of the major focus to encourage the youngster right from primary school to secondary school to university to be interested in science. I think that is a first start, good start. But I think Malaysia as a whole, the federal government should also do the same, right? So that are 2 points I want to add to what you just said. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I must say time flies. I think we should come to an end soon. It's 10 o'clock already. Please give everyone of the panelists a big applause. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. Before we end the evening, I would like to invite Mr. Sept to present tokens of appreciation to our guests. Firstly, to the World Bank Director of Regional Partnerships, Dr. Ulrich Zachau. Next, Mr. Faris Haddad Zavos, World Bank Country Manager, Malaysia. Next, the World Bank country economist for Malaysia, Dr. Richard Record. Associate Professor Teo Wing Leong. Dato Heng Hak Lee, CEO of Electronics Technology. And the World Bank country economist for Malaysia, Dr. Richard Record.